Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is my final wrap-up for Jane Austen July. Jane Austen July has been such a success this year. I read so many books and I did not get burnt out. I thought that I was going to, and I actually still have a few books from the library that I didn't get to, and I'm just gonna keep going because I haven't burnt out yet and I want to read them. And so yeah, this has been such a great month. I've got another stack of books in front of me. Some of them are books that I took, most of the month to read, and so that's why maybe that's why the stack is so big. But yeah, it was a really successful month and I had so much fun. I watched some great videos put out by other booktubers. It was so entertaining and I have really enjoyed talking with you in the comments. My favorite video, I have to say, that was made this month was the one where Aaron, my husband, ranked my Jane Austen screen adaptations. And so if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I'm gonna link it in the cards and in the description box below. Please check it out. It is so entertaining. I find it really funny. And so yeah, that's been my favorite video of the month. Okay, let's just dive right in. I read Sanditon by Jane Austen and Another Lady. This is a Sanditon is a partial manuscript that Jane Austen didn't finish. It's the last thing that she wrote and she just became too ill to finish it, and it's very unfortunate because that first bit of manuscript she wrote about 11 chapters, about 70 pages, and it's so promising. But if Jane Austen couldn't finish it, this other lady did a phenomenal job. I really, really, really love this one. This is a reread for me. It's a 5 stars. I love it. I love what she did with the story. I love that she remained true to what you can tell from 11 chapters. And she really has, I really think that she's picked up on the voice and the wit of Jane Austen. I loved it so much. The main character in this is Charlotte Haywood. She is 22. She is one of 14 children, and she is invited by the Parkers to come and stay in Sanditon for the summer. Sanditon is a seaside village that Mr. Parker and Lady Denham are trying to turn into a resort, a vacation destination. The Parkers are an interesting family. They're a family that is consumed by their health, and there's an element of hypochondria to it, but really, like, they're just so consumed with their health, that's all they want to talk about. Mr. Parker has 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and in 2 pages before Jane Austen finishes her manuscripts, she introduces us to Sidney Parker, Mr. Parker's brother, who becomes, you can tell, because he is mentioned a couple times before, you can tell that Jane Austen intended him to be one of the main characters and the potential love interest in the story. It's so great. On page 14, I made a note that it seems like there's kind of this comparison for me between Mr. Parker and Lady Denham with Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine. There's a certain element of the way that Mr. Collins treats Lady Catherine as his patroness. There's an element of that with Mr. Parker and Lady Denham. So that was interesting. And then Austen's humor was still prime in this one. I noted in a letter written by Mr. Parker's sister, it was so hilarious, and I'm actually going to read a bit of it because I was just laughing so hard. And this letter again really highlights their focus on their health. So his sister Diana is writing to him, and she says she's asking how he was doing because he was in a carriage accident and he hurt his foot. And she says, 2 years ago, I happened to be calling on Mrs. Sheldon when her coachman sprained his foot as he was cleaning the carriage and could hardly limp into the house. but by the immediate use of friction alone steadily persevered in, and I rubbed his ankle with my own hand for 6 hours without intermission. He was well in 3 days. So good. And then she talks about Susan, who has been suffering much from the headache, and 6 leeches a day for 10 days together relieved her so little that we thought it right to change our measures. And being convinced on examination that much of the evil lay in her gum, I persuaded her to attack the disorder there. She has accordingly had 3 teeth drawn and is decidedly better, but her nerves are a good deal deranged. So good. And then she talks about their youngest brother, Arthur. He, I am happy to say, is tolerably well enough, though more languid than I like, and I fear for his liver. It's so good. I love it so much. So that's the, I read, all those things that I read are from the Jane Austen portion. And then another lady finishes the story, and so you can tell, here is what Jane Austen wrote, and here is what the other lady wrote. And I want to read a portion here where in this portion is where Jane Austen finished her writing and this other lady took it up. And I want you to try and guess in the comment section where Jane Austen finished and this other lady took it up. Okay? Does that sound like a fun challenge? Okay, here we go. And as Lady Denham was not there, Charlotte had leisure to look about her and to be told by Mrs. Parker that the whole-length portrait of a stately gentleman, which placed over the mantelpiece caught the eye immediately, was the picture of Sir Henry Denham, and that among many miniatures in another part of the room, little conspicuous, represented Mr. Hollis. Poor Mr. Hollis! It was impossible not to feel him hardly used, to be obliged to stand back in his own house and see the best place by the fire constantly occupied by Sir Henry Denham. Lady Denham's brisk style of greeting on entering made it plain that though she regarded their visit as a necessary piece of civility, she had no intention of exercising equal civility in being inconvenienced by it herself. Okay, so there you have it. Guess. Let me know in the comment section, pause the video, and guess where you think Jane Austen finished and the lady took it up. And I'm going to, at the end of this video, reveal where that is, okay? All right, I continued in my Mr. and Mrs. Darcy mystery series by Carrie Bebris with The Deception at Lyme, or The Peril of Persuasion. This one was, again, so good. I really love this series. This one, Mr. and Mrs. Darcy are vacationing at Lyme Regis, where they encounter Sir Walter Elliot, Miss Elizabeth Elliot, Captain Wentworth and Anne, Mr. William Elliot, Mrs. Clay, Mrs. Smith, and anybody else? That could be it. Now, this one was much more of a slow burn mystery, but I still really enjoyed it. I loved that at the beginning, before it even starts, there is a map of the Cobb, and this plays a huge role in Persuasion itself and in this story as well. And then she goes into closer pictures of areas of the Cobb. This is the quay and the southern arm of the Cobb. The gin shop. They call it the gin shop. It's not actually a gin shop. Some pictures of the steps at the Cobb, Captain Harville's cottage, and Granny's teeth, which are further more dangerous steps at the Cobb. So I liked that she went into that detail. And then I loved the opening, the prologue. On the southern coast of England, near the town of Lyme Regis, an ancient seawall rises from the water. Like a great open-mouthed serpent, its head reaches into the sea, its jaws act like a key, its body curves round to form a harbor, its tail stretches to the shore. Known as the Cobb for reasons lost to time, this man-made barrier more than half a millennium old is but a youthful newcomer to a wild, unstable coast where prehistoric creatures once dwelled. Were it not for the Cobb, there would be no harbor, and were it not for the harbor, there would be no Lyme. For the rugged shoreline the seawall faces offers no natural protected anchorage. The construction of the wall proved the making of the town, their fates and fortunes entwined. From simple medieval beginnings, the Cobb, the harbor, and the village together evolved into a thriving port worthy of royal notice. In this haven, ships were built and launched, trading vessels unloaded exotic wares, sailors returning from distant lands found welcome, and visitors invested hope and fortunes in the alleged restorative powers of sea bathing, all sheltered by a mighty stone guardian from the caprice of the sea and the violence of Mother Nature. In the summer of 1815, however, even the Cobb could not safeguard Lyme from the tempests of human nature. Love it. I finished Georgette Hale's Regency, England by Jennifer Kloester. This was fantastic. I loved this. I loved her writing style. It was so easy to read, and it contained so much interesting information. Let me give you an idea. There's a chapter on up and down the social ladder, at home in town and country, a man's world, the gentle sex, on the town, the pleasure haunts of London, the fashionable resorts, getting about, and so that's like carriages and long distance travel and stuff, what to wear, shopping, eat, drink, and be merry, the sporting life, business and the military, and then who's who in the Regency. There are 6 appendices, which are also really interesting. A glossary of cant and common Regency phrases, newspapers and magazines, books and hair, timeline, reading about the Regency and where next, and Georgette Hale's Regency novels. I've marked a couple of things here that I wanted to share with you. In the chapter on the town, she's talking about Hyde Park. At the end of the 17th century, when King William III moved his court to nearby Kensington Palace, he regularly had to make his way through Hyde Park from the palace to St. James's. Finding it to be dark and dangerous, the king ordered the way to be lit. 300 oil lamps lined the highway, which was known for a time as the Rue des Rois, Way of the King, but which eventually came to be known more familiarly as Rotten Row. Just inside the perimeter of Hyde Park, Rotten Row was a broad roadway that ringed the entire park and on which visitors were able to walk, ride a horse, or drive a carriage. I thought that was fascinating because I've read about Rotten Row in so many of the books that I read that are set in the Regency era, and so it was fascinating to learn how that came to be. I was always curious to know where that name came from. In the chapter on business and the military, she talks about the postal service, which was fascinating. Letter writing was an important part of Regency life, although the cost could be prohibitive. Postage was calculated according to the distance traveled to deliver it, with the charge borne by the recipient rather than the sender, which is so fascinating. And so, you know, for someone to be a prolific letter writer, you know, that's not necessarily great if the person you're writing to prolifically is poor, because they have to pay for your letters. And then I'd heard of this too, and so it was interesting to get more information. Members of the peerage and of both houses of parliament were entitled to have their mail delivered free of charge using a system known as franking, according to which an MP or peer had to sign his name and write his address on the outside of the letter to avoid the charge. Isn't that interesting? She's got a section on rules and etiquette, and she goes into some detail starting here, continuing. This is so interesting. Both of these pages plus both of these pages are all rules of etiquette. So interesting. And then I'm marking these to keep for reference because she's got a general fashion glossary, which is great if you're not sure, if you're reading a book and you're not sure what they're talking about, what a person is wearing. Also, who's who in the Regency. She lists people and tells you briefly about them. Again, a great reference. And then finally, the glossary of cant and common Regency phrases, I thought would also be a fantastic reference to keep marked. So this book was fantastic. I also finished Behind Closed Doors at... This book is so heavy. At Home in Regency, England by Amanda Vickery. This book was only okay. I ended up having to basically skim through most of it to finish it. It was just too dense for me to be enjoyable. So if you are a fan of extremely scholarly, dense history, then this might be the book for you. In her chapter on setting up home, I did note this. It was a truth universally acknowledged that a Georgian house with a drawing room, French windows, and lawn must be in want of a mistress. A man in possession of a comfortable house and a financial competence was a prime target of Cupid's arrows. Courting men were required to offer a suitable establishment before a couple could embark on married life, so a man's house and prospects were at issue when a young woman examined the small print of an offer of marriage. And then she goes on to talk about basically all of Jane Austen's novels and how that was true in those novels. So this one was okay, but I've read better histories. I read a few of the essays in the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, which were so interesting. I read the essay on Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice by Rachel M. Brownstein, which kind of just delved into those three novels and was really interesting. To start with, her thesis for this essay, rather, I want to consider the conjunctions of romantic narrative and ironic commentary in Jane Austen's first three full-length novels, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice. And then later she says, this novel will consider the ways irony interrogates romance and romanticism in these three novels. I will conclude with Pride and Prejudice because it provides a happy ending, the balance of forces being most strenuous and perfect there. Okay, and I found her section on Sense and Sensibility especially to be so interesting. Marianne and Eleanor are more interestingly alike than they are different. The first chapter acknowledges that Marianne has sense as well as sensibility, and that Eleanor has an excellent heart, that's a quote, and strong feelings as well as prudence. The opposing values of romance and practical realism are debated as each sister takes issue with the conduct and the doctrine of the other. Marianne loves the poetry of Cooper and Scott and picturesque landscapes. She believes in first and passionate love, a meeting of tastes and minds. She trusts her feelings to guide her conduct. Eleanor is more circumspect, more aware of how the self interacts with others. In her view, conventions are necessary and even useful. The sisters are devoted to one another, but they can be cutting in debate, as when Marianne pretends to think Eleanor believes that, quote, our judgments are given us merely to be subservient to those of our neighbors, end quote. Each exaggerates and observes and indeed seems deliberately to fashion herself as her sister's opposite. Marianne depends for her identity on Eleanor's watchful judgments of her. Eleanor fears the force of Marianne's sympathy. So interesting. And then later in the essay, she writes, while the cultivated Dashwood sisters argue about right conduct and the picturesque instead of hunting for men, contrasting pairs of sisters underscore or undercut their superiority and gentility, and perhaps even the importance of the contrast between them. Big-mouthed Nancy and small-eyed Lucy Steele, who mean to marry as well as possible, and polite Lady Middleton and inappropriate Mrs. Palmer, who already have. Lucy's calculating approach to life and her prohibited love affair with Edward caricature Eleanor's and the passionate love that nearly destroys Marianne, as elaborately parodied by the story of the two Elizas that Colonel Brandon tells. The detail of that story, a callous parent committed to primogeniture, brothers at odds with one another, two women's lives irrevocably lost, echo the novel's plots and its themes of selfishness and greed. Debates about taste seem a luxury and true gentility a romantic dream, as a divorce and a couple of seductions, a fall into a life of sin and an illegitimate birth, a secret engagement and even a duel touch the lives of scrupulous and sensitive Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood. Isn't that interesting? All right. And then there's another essay called Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion by John Wilcher, which was also really interesting. The discussion about Mansfield Park I found to be, I found them all really interesting. Discussion about Mansfield Park, he says, it is not only psychological depth and narrative orchestration that make Mansfield Park a milestone in the English novel. The novelist imagines the physical world in which her figures move to have a palpable presence and effective bearing on their lives. At one point in Pride and Prejudice, the narrative remarks casually on, quote, the shrubbery where this conversation passed. Settings are never neutral backgrounds in Mansfield Park, and the gardens at Sanditon famously are made to play an integral, even determinative part in the action. It is not only that one can read them in allegorical terms, as the punning exchange of Henry and Maria about her prospects invite one to do. It is rather as if emotional pressures and urgencies were felt and conveyed to the reader in spatial terms, as when Maria declares so intensely, "I cannot get out," as the starling said. As the figures move, disperse, and reassemble within the various venues Sanditon and Mansfield and Portsmouth offer them, one is made vividly conscious not only of the opportunities and inhibitions of these spaces, but of their being at issue, contested over, claimed, and owned. Maria's disregard of the locked gate is to be echoed in Tom's overturning the arrangements of his father's rooms. Both express their egotistical drives as the usurpation of territory. Fanny seeks to keep Edmund at the window looking at the stars. Mary lures him indoors with her music. Characters and their bodies are imagined precisely within settings that are drawn into the narrative and act as provocations to conversation and action. This capacity to dramatize space and to make the human drama inseparable from its physical location reaches its peak in the scenes at Portsmouth. As Sir Edward Said observes, for example, the solitary candle that Fanny's father holds between himself and the paper, without any reference to her possible convenience, renders very precisely the dangers of unsociability, of lonely insularity, of diminished awareness that are rectified in larger and better administered spaces. It is this evening that Fanny remembers 3 months later, when her depression is deepened by the sun that brings its glare to illuminate the dirt and disorder of her parents' parlor. When she returns to Mansfield with Edmund in early spring, an affiliation between emotional state, narrative purpose, and landscape setting, the trees in that delightful state which, while it actually given to the sight, more yet remains for the imagination, suggests the possibilities that are to be explored further in Emma and Persuasion. I find this stuff so fascinating. I don't know if you enjoy literary criticism as much as I do, but I find it so interesting, and it really enhances my enjoyment of the book to learn more about how it was written and what it means. In the section on Emma, he writes, but for the most part, the narrative voice of Emma, while flexible and capable even of picking up Mr. Elton's vulgarisms when in his vicinity, is overwhelmingly the style of Emma. Youthful, confident, presumptive, witty, dogmatic, commanding, assured. Quote, Harriet was to sit again the next day, and Mr. Elton, just as he ought, entreated for the permission of attending and reading to them again. End quote. Though this is formally information given by the narrator, the phrase, just as he ought, construes his motives according to Emma's point of view. Sometimes one can catch the narrator assuming Emma's viewpoint deliberately to trick the reader. A few moments later, Mrs. Weston is said to talk to Mr. Elton of Miss Smith, quote, not in the least suspecting she was addressing a lover, end quote. Frank Churchill, pressed to visit the Bates, is said to consent only, quote, with the hope of Hartfield to reward him, end quote. In each of these cases, Emma's view of motives is allowed to tease the reader to appear as if it's the book's. But if the novel is bounded by this rule, a flexible rule of being shown through Emma's eyes, it is also bounded spatially. Emma is a novel in which circumscribed settings, limited spaces, and confinement, comforting and enabling, but at the same time imprisoning and suffocating, are crucially important. Highbury, the county village almost the size of a town in which the novel is set, is conceptually, if not geographically, isolated from the rest of the world. Augusta Elton lets it be known that Mr. Elton has expressed fears lest the retirement of Highbury be disagreeable to his bride, and recommending Bath to Emma, comments that it would be a charming introduction for you who have lived so secluded a life. She also thinks that Jane Fairfax is wasting sweetness on the desert air. Highbury is provincial and confined, a city-state, a commonwealth, that Frank Churchill takes out his freedom in by purchasing gloves at Ford's and declaring his amour patrice. The true freedom of Highbury, of course, is won by the hard work of parish meetings and neighborly concern that Mr. Knightley puts in. One of the achievements of the novel is to populate the Highbury world and to give it apparent depth. The loose ends and superfluous names that figure so much in Miss Bates' gossip do not just serve to camouflage the essential bits of information that she is feeding into the plot. They are a technically adroit means of conveying, especially in the Highbury ball scene, this sense of a social commonwealth. It is not only in Miss Bates' speeches that characters are spoken of familiarly who are never formally presented. Mr. Perry, the doctor who may or may not be setting up his carriage, is only the most frequently mentioned of a host of figures who pass in and out of the narrative and acquire a kind of familiarity by proxy. It is as if by having William Larkins, Robert Martin, Mrs. Goddard, and many others, Mrs. Hodges, John Abdy, Patty, James, the Coxes, even the Coles, partially within our field of vision, the novel persuades us of their richly extended existence beyond it. What Emma learns in this novel is not to think like Mr. Knightley, but that she has always, in fact, thought like him. There is no element of capitulation in the novel's ending, rather one of celebratory recognition. Their reconciliation would be the conclusion of a conventional romantic narrative, but Emma and Mr. Knightley converse a good deal after their private engagement. Unlike Elizabeth and Darcy, who in a similar situation educate each other into the intimacies of equals, Emma and Mr. Knightley already enjoy their reciprocal knowledge. They chafe and tease each other, working through the past, replaying their relationship in different terms. It is almost as if Austen were presenting Emma and Mr. Knightley as an already married couple. These scenes are by no means simply occasions for Emma to confess to being wrong. What had she to wish for? Nothing but to grow more worthy of him, whose intentions and judgment had been ever so superior to her own. This is a quote. Nothing but that the lessons of her past folly might teach her humility and circumspection in future. End quote. This is Emma thinking, vivaciously but also extravagantly, as usual. Isn't that amazing? I thought that was brilliant. And then in the section on Persuasion, he says, Persuasion is then a novel about the inner and the outer life. This evocation of the sterility of Elizabeth's social space is a preface to its concern with the outward capability and inner turbulence of the quiet, recessive, and only gradually introduced heroine. Anne is without power in her family circle, as she is at first without dramatic prominence in the text, but the narrative becomes gradually suffused with her presence, idioms, and approach. Yet it is through negatives, absences, understatements, merely the cadences and phrasing that shape her introspections, not through an assertive or dramatic voice, that Anne Elliot becomes for the reader a presence in her world. And I thought that was so brilliant, and that right there explains why I believe that the 2022 Persuasion adaptation does not work. It is not subtle at all, and it really doesn't show you that introspective world of Anne Elliot. All right, and then he also mentioned the depth of Anne's solitary consciousness is contrasted with the absence of reflection, for Sir Walter picks up no books but the Baronetage in the life of the surrounding small-time country gentry. The Musgroves are warm-hearted and unaffected, unlike the Elliots, but the whole family share an unreflecting Philistinism. Finding Charles Hayter with books before him, the Musgroves, quote, were sure all could not be right, and talked with grave faces of his studying himself to death, end quote. They inhabit a taken-for-granted world without an inkling that people are not entirely to be known by their appearances, without a glimpse of the pain behind Anne's apparent capability, and quite without insight into their own motives, as, for example, when Henrietta expresses so much concern for Dr. Shirley's health. When a man she likes talks to her about the value of firmness, Louisa Musgrove takes him with her family's literal mindedness and is resolute at every opportunity, becoming impulsive by rule. And that is key to the later scene on the Cobb where she has her accident. And here we go, we talk about that. The accident at Lyme, which concludes Volume 1, is indeed the turning point both in the relationship of Anne and Wentworth and in Anne's narrative position. Anne has responded with precisely similar authority to Another Fall earlier in the tale, but the difference is now that her competence is dramatized and her performance seen by appreciative witnesses. Anne's becoming increasingly an object of regard in her circle is thus paralleled and matched by her increasing presence as a speaker and performer in the text. In Volume 2, her responses are less elided in the narrative and more fully represented within it. She is less and less confined to the responsive reactive role. The glances and attentions of Mr. Elliot have at least this positive effect. Quote, "My idea of good company, Mr. Elliot, is the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company." This assertiveness in his presence is a narrative as well as a psychological development. Anne starts declaring her opinions to willing listeners so that her private thoughts about the Musgrove sisters' impending marriages, for instance, are expressed fully and openly. "I am extremely glad indeed," cried Anne. She exclaims that Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove are excellent parents. She laughs out loud at Musgrove's sketch of Louisa and Benwick's courtship. This development culminates in dialogue with Harville at the White Hart, which is thus as much a formal as an emotional climax to the novel. In an essay called Class, written by Juliet McMaster, I thought it was very interesting. She goes into detail about class in the novels, and in Emma, she says this: "Highest in the Highbury circles, then, is Mr. Knightley of Donwell Abbey, the first in virtue as in place. Austen insists that part of his virtue is that he refuses to trade on his rank. He walks when status-conscious people like the Osbornes and the Watsons would make a point of riding in a carriage. When he does get out his carriage, it is to transport Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax, not himself. Though he could leave the management of his estate to an employee, he takes an active interest, is often in conference with his steward William Larkins, and is warmly interested in the domestic affairs of his tenant farmer Robert Martin. In Persuasion, by contrast, we are invited to consider the derogation of such duties by the bad landlord Sir Walter Elliot, who is consequently exiled from his estate and even leaves the farewells to his daughter. Sir Walter is enraptured by the prestige of his position, but neglects the responsibilities." And then one more in that chapter. "In Jane Austen's world, human worth is to be judged by standards better and more enduring than social status. But social status is always relevant. With amused detachment, she registers exactly the social prominence of each of her characters and judges them for the ways in which they judge each other's. The importance assigned to class distinction is the source of much of her comedy and her irony, as of her social satire." So interesting. And then I read one final essay about money by Edward Copeland, and he goes into detail about what money means for the status of people, and he actually lays it out. Like, what would it mean if you have, what does it mean if you have 200 pounds a year, 300 pounds a year, 400, 500, all the way up to above 4,000 a year. And so I thought that was really interesting in helping me to understand kind of people's reactions to other people's incomes. So this was really fascinating. So if you're a fan of literary criticism, I advise that you check out the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, edited by Edward Copeland and Juliet McMaster. Okay, continuing on with some literary criticism is The Genius of Jane Austen, Her Love of Theater and Why She Works in Hollywood by Paula Byrne. I really did enjoy this, and again, as you can see, I marked a lot of different things. She talks about how plays of the time were a significant impact on Jane Austen's work. In a chapter on, her chapter on Sense and Sensibility was so good, and it really opened my eyes to better appreciate this novel, and I need to reread it after reading this. Austen's principle of pairings is the structural base of Sense and Sensibility. The pairing of Eleanor and Lucy is developed through their parallel situation. Both women are in love with the same man. In the final chapters leading up to the end of Volume 1, and in the closer parallel of their behavior in Volume 2. The revelation of Lucy's secret engagement at the end of Volume 1 echoes the ambiguity surrounding the truth of the secret engagement between Marianne and Willoughby, and shows how contrasts, parallels, and discordant similarities of action and exchange constantly resonate against each other. Austen thus ends the first volume with a theatrical flourish, and in Volume 2 she deploys a further quasi-theatrical device, the set piece of a confrontation between two female rivals. In her chapter on Pride and Prejudice, she talks about the exploration of class and social prejudices. The tension between town and country values had long been a staple of Restoration and 18th century stage comedy, and in Pride and Prejudice, Austen uses this motif for her thoroughgoing exploration of class and social prejudices. In Mansfield Park, Austen explores female consciousness in 4 young women and focuses upon the comparisons and contrasts of female conduct in the courtship process. So interesting. I just find this so interesting. I've never read Lover's Vows, but Lover's Vows is a really important, the play where the characters in Mansfield Park put on Lover's Vows is a really key section of Mansfield Park. One of the most striking parallels between Lover's Vows and Mansfield Park, which is wholly lost on a reader unfamiliar with the play, is that between Sir Thomas Bertram and Baron Wildenhain. As will be seen in the next chapter, Austen particularly relishes the great comic stage confrontation between Sir Thomas and Yates in the role of the Baron. I need to read Lover's Vows. So I can highly recommend The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne. Be warned, it is mostly literary criticism, so if that's not your thing, you need to be aware of that jumping in. It's a little harder to tell because of the cover, and it's only the very last chapter where she talks about why Austen works in Hollywood, but that chapter is very interesting. Okay, I also did a reread of Austenland by Shannon Hale, which was just fun. It's a short novel about Jane Hayes, a New Yorker who goes over to England to have a vacation in an immersive Regency era experience. But I loved the dedication at the beginning. Shannon Hale writes, "For Colin Firth, you're a really great guy, but I'm married, so I think we should just be friends." So good. And then the prologue opens like this. "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a 30-something woman in possession of a satisfying career and a fabulous hairdo must be in want of very little. And Jane Hayes, pretty enough and clever enough, was certainly thought to have little to distress her. There was no husband, but those weren't necessary anymore. There were boyfriends, and if they came and went in a regular stream of mutual dissatisfaction, well, that was the way of things, wasn't it?" I love that she did a combination of the opening sentences of Pride and Prejudice and Emma in that prologue. So that was a fun, light read. I also read Pride, Prejudice, and Poisons by Elizabeth Blake. This is the first in her Jane Austen Society Mystery series. And this one was just okay. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I think I just didn't get along with the writing style so much. And the sleuth in this one, the amateur sleuth, is the type of amateur sleuth that drives me crazy. So this one was just okay. It's about antiquarian bookstore proprietor Aaron Coleridge, who decides to investigate because the president of their local Jane Austen Society is killed. My favorite part of this book was that it was set in Yorkshire. I think that was great. The characters in this love quoting Jane Austen to each other, so that was very entertaining. And then I also read Murder on the Bride's Side by Tracy Kiely, which is the second in her series. This is a mystery series set in the United States that has definite Jane Austen connections. In this one, it's Sense and Sensibility. Elizabeth Parker is the maid of honor for her friend Bridget, who is getting married, and then the day after the wedding, a family member is murdered. And this one was just really fun. I really enjoy this series, and I've already put the next two. There's only 4 in this series, and I've already put the next 2 on hold at the library to read because they're just so fun. Again, the main character quotes Jane Austen all the time, and she talks about how she read Sense and Sensibility kind of insatiably preparing for this wedding because it was what calmed her down. So yeah, a really fun mystery series. Okay, I told you that I would let you know where Jane Austen ended and another lady began. I hope that you wrote in the comments where you think that happened. I'm going to let you know. The last sentence that Jane Austen wrote in this book, I'll read it again. And as Lady Denham was not there, Charlotte had leisure to look about her and to be told by Mrs. Parker that the whole-length portrait of a stately gentleman, which, placed over the mantelpiece, caught the eye immediately, was the picture of Sir Henry Denham, and that among many miniatures in another part of the room, little conspicuous, represented Mr. Hollis. Poor Mr. Hollis! It was impossible not to feel him hardly used. To be obliged to stand back in his own house and to see the best place by the fire constantly occupied by Sir Henry Denham. Lady Denham's brisk style of greeting on entering made it plain that though she regarded her visit as a necessary piece of civility, she had no intention of exercising equal civility and being inconvenienced by it herself. The last sentence written by Jane Austen is, to be obliged to stand back in his own house and see the best place by the fire constantly occupied by Sir Henry Denham. I think, personally, if I didn't know that, I would have had a very hard time figuring out where Jane Austen ended and the other lady began. But I would love to know if you got it right. Do you feel like it was really noticeable, or did it feel like a smooth entering of another person's writing? I would love to chat with you about that as well. All right, whew, this is turning into a long video, but yeah, I just really wanted to share with you some of the things that really caught my attention in the books that I was reading. Again, like I said, I had such a fantastic Jane Austen July. So let me know in the comment section down below if you've read any of these books. I would love to chat with you about them. Also, let me know, is literary criticism something that you are at all interested in? Or is it just me? And I will see you for another video soon. Bye.